Welcome back to another episode of 40 Facts About the 40K Universe. I am your host Gershwin and you are watching One Mind Syndicate. Today we take on another viewer request. Now this video is going to make a lot more sense if you have some background knowledge on the Horus Heresy. If you don't, we have a whole playlist that explains what the Horus Heresy is and what it means to this specific video. If not, you're fine. Let's just continue watching 40 Facts About the Shattered Legions. The Shattered Legions is a collective term used when referring to the survivors of the three Loyalist Space Marine legions that were betrayed during the calamitous events of the Dropsite Massacre of Isstvan V during the opening stages of the Horus Heresy. To learn more about the Horus Heresy, like I said before, please check out our Horus Heresy playlist. Born on the blood-soaked sands of the Orgol Depression, the Shattered Legions were the consequence of betrayal. The Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands, all cast down by the treachery of their supposed brothers, when the Wordbearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion revealed their true allegiance to Warmaster Horus. Of the hundreds of thousands of Legiones Astartes warriors committed to the initial drop, 10,000 more would be cut down in the brutal pursuit that followed, and the titanic void battle that ensued between the traitors and loyalist fleets throughout the Isstvan system. In the solar days and weeks following the Dropsite Massacre, elements of the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard were scattered far and wide across the Northern Imperium, having been forced to hastily plot warp jumps to escape the traitorous ambush. While some scattered alone, it was also the case that vessels of all three legions came together in small clusters in the darkness, wounded and distrustful of one another following the massacre, that violently destroyed the legion's chain of command. Once damages were repaired and wounds bound, these clustered forces split apart again to seek their own path, often cast wide by the burgeoning warp storms that would slowly erupt into the ruined storm, in order to find their way back to their homes or reliable commands. In other instances, these ragged squadrons remained together, seeking better odds of survival in a galaxy of war in the company of allies who had borne the same savage trial they had, and so were the Shattered Legions born. Of the three Space Marine legions betrayed on Isstvan V, the Iron Hands remain yet the most numerous, for most of their forces were held in orbital reserve when the massacre was unleashed. What remained of the Iron Hands' ruling cadre after the Dropsite Massacre, a body called the Clan Council, it convened in an effort to assume command of the fight against Horus, but at Othic Minor, they fell prey to further ambush by the Warmaster's purge fleets, and with the destruction of the battle group flash ship Crown of Flame, the Council was no more. It fell to Shadrach Medusan, commander of the Iron Hands Clan Sorgol, to take command of the bulk of the Iron Hand formations within contact, and to remold it into a force capable of exacting vengeance for the betrayal of Isstvan V, and to contest Horus's advance on Terra. Medusan achieved his mission by allowing forces drawn from desperate elements of three legions into a new and unbreakable whole, its strength far greater than the sum of its contingents. The process was far from simple, for each of the legions was possessed of its own ideology and vision, and on numerous occasions, bitter and grieving legionnaires came within a blade's breadth of shedding one another's blood. Medusan's visionary genius was to divide the survivors of Isstvan V, in total upwards to 20,000 Loyalist Astartes, into mixed, independent cells, and distribute them across the territories that the Warmaster had won. His goal in doing so was twofold. Most importantly, Medusan's forces would wage a guerrilla war behind the main line, and with every victory, no matter how seemingly insignificant, bleed the traitor forces and slow Horus's march on Terra. Medusan's secondary goal was simply to exact raw, bloody vengeance from the traitors for Isstvan V. For 3 solar years, Medusan oversaw a campaign so subtle in its strategy and execution that even the Warmaster himself did not realize that the thousands of raids, assassinations, sabotages, and ambushes inflicted upon his hosts as they advanced across the Imperium were in fact the work of one man. While the survivors of Isstvan V were the first of those who would be dubbed the Shattered Legions, they were far from the only example of desperate Astarte elements coming together under such circumstances and fighting their own shadow wars from their respective masters. The anarchy and woe that Horus's treachery had unleashed across the galaxy cannot be understated, and as the Ruin Storm expanded, numerous Legionist Astarte forces were stranded, isolated from their regular chain of command, and left without a Primarch or any other authority they might recognize. Some Astarte forces, in particular those serving with fleets re-exploring the dark marshes of the galaxy when the Horus Heresy erupted, had no notion which side of the galaxy civil war their Primarch had declared for, and their own allegiance should thereby fall. Many Astartes, faced with the impossible decision, chose to declare openly for neither side and instead pursued the last order they had received from their Primarch, regardless of the outcome. While the Shattered Legion forces operating under Shadrach Medusan were united in their ultimate mission, many other groups fought towards divergent goals. Many had no greater ultimate goal in mind other than vengeance, a cause that would sustain them until the Horus Heresy had ended, and in many cases, long into the Great Scouring. Regardless of the circumstances of its coming into being, it is unlikely that any Astarte body would have remained a cohesive force without the leadership of a strong-willed or charismatic commander. Separated from their Primarchs, such forces had so much to overcome, and few survived long enough without some other surrogate superior. Medusan was far from the only Legionist Astarte officer who was able to draw together elements from several different legions into a single effective force, and each had their own way of doing so. Some Shattered Legion commanders were warriors of a singular vision or unique wisdom, able to meld their forces into a coherent whole with just a word alone. In their chains of command, the constituent elements of the Shattered Legion forces generally adhered to the Inner Legion Code put down at the outset of the Great Crusade. These codes define an equivalency of rank between commanders of different legions, so that mixing forces could operate side by side in the war to unify mankind. These codes recognize such terms as Praetor, Centurion, Sergeant, and many others, even though officers in question might be known by a Murad title, drawn from the culture of their own legion, or the homeworld from which it was recruited. Even in the aftermath of whatever great betrayal or disaster had brought them into being, the Inner Legion codes remain largely intact, and so, even in forces constituted for multiple legions, a default chain of command already existed. Given the trauma to which many Astarte officers had been subjected, the transition was far from smooth, and the divergent command style frequently sat ill, but in the main, a potent leader was able to command in a manner broadly in line with the long-established Space Marine Legion standard. Because Legion ranks were invariably kept intact, it was not uncommon for Shattered Legion forces to feature an uneven portion of officers and legionnaires from different legions. For example, a Praetor might be accompanied by but a single squad of his own legion, but by whole of his rank have command over an entire company of warriors drawn from another legion, themselves led by no officer with rank higher than a centurion. As the Horus Heresy progressed, it became evident that the traitors had their own Shattered Legion forces, though often brought into being under somewhat different circumstances. Many were simply forces cut off from their own legions and pursuing existing orders for fear of censure or worse. Some traitor forces appeared to have come into being as some manner of punishment, cast into exile, and instructed not to return until some grave task was completed. Often the execution of Shattered Legionist Astarte survivors. Thus, Shattered Legion formations, made of mixed Astarte forces, were able to be founded on both sides of mankind's galactic civil war, engaging in ceaseless, unseen, and bitter shadow wars throughout the Horus Heresy and beyond. Constituted as they were from the remnants of the betrayed, the orphaned, and the defeated, most groups that could be counted as Shattered Legions were comparatively small, compared to the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands strong ranks of their parent legions. Most numbered in excess of several hundred, to some having numbers as many as 2,000. Beyond the fact that each Shattered Legion represented a mix of several different legions, 3 being the most common, there was little or no commonality in organization. Some were able to field the iconic units of which their parent formations were well known, such as the Medusan Immortals of the Iron Hands, or the Pyroclasts of the Salamanders, while fate and misfortune has stripped others of any trace of such heritage. One feature common in many Astartes amongst the Shattered Legions was the ability to adapt to circumstances, for without such a capacity, most would not have survived the betrayal that had brought them into being. Detached of legion lines and communication and supply, they had at best limited access to specialized war machines and were forced to rely primarily on post-human strengths and the ability they were bred into each and every legionnaire by the genius of the Emperor and his gene rights. Standard legion orders of battle were impossible to impose, and so commanders used whatever mix of squad and vehicle they had to complete the mission at hand. This fact made guarding against Shattered Legion attacks a difficult task indeed, for it was largely impossible for their enemies to predict what force might be brought to bear on a potential target. Over time, Astartes from often very different legions learned not only to appreciate their cousin's unique way of war, but to integrate them into their own tactical doctrines. Company-sized forces made up of squads from several different legions would therefore deploy and fight so as to amplify the strength of each legion's traditions. Notable Shattered Legion survivors was captain of the 111th Clan Company and commander of the strike cruiser Veritas Ferrum, Dern Atticus. He arrived with the second wave of Iron Hand vessels at Isfahan V, due to the damage sustained by the Callias attack of the fleeing Emperor's children at Calindius, after Fulgrim unsuccessfully tried to woo his brother Primarch Ferrus Manus to the War Master Horus's cause. A substantial number of Iron Hand vessels in the secondary wave were destroyed by the traitor's surprise attack. After receiving word of their Primarch's death, the Veritas Ferrum made a desperate attempt to flee, but received a Vox hail from 2 Thunderhawk gunships bearing survivors of the massacre. Sergeant Kidal of the Salamander's 139th Company convinced Atticus of their identity, and so Atticus ordered his ships to recover the survivors. But in the ensuing melee, the Iron Hands lost many more lives, the number of survivors they had just rescued, before finally making an emergency jump into the warp. Aboard the Veritas Ferrum was Atrax, a surviving dreadnought of the 111th Clan Company, and Aulus, who was a sergeant of the Iron Hands 111th Clan Company. He survived the void ambush of Isfahan V, but would later be killed on the ship's bridge in orbit over a newly discovered death world of Pythos. Revered captain of the Iron Hands 65th Company, Ulrich Brathen, was another notable survivor. He had survived the massacre of the killing grounds of the Orgol Depression on Isfahan V during the Dropsite Massacre, sustaining horrific wounds that left him in a permanent agony. Kept in stasis, he led the loyalist crew of the Sisyphum in a successful hit-and-run campaign throughout the remainder of the Horus Heresy. Captain Bratham's ultimate fate is unknown. Catamus Tyro served as equerry to the captain, fighting alongside his fellow Isfahan survivors aboard the Iron Hands vessel, the Sisypheum. Frater Thematica was an Iron Father of the Iron Hands Legion, a member of the Morlocks, and a survivor of the killing fields of the Orlac Depression on the world of Isfahan V. It was Thematica who helped establish contact with the desperate group of loyalist forces who had escaped the Dropsite Massacre, and he helped develop a strategy for their survival. He would go on to serve amongst the valiant loyalist crew of the Sisypheum. Following Isfahan V, it is believed that he is the longest serving and senior-most survivor of the Iron Fathers within the 10th Legion. one of the few surviving Morlocks of the decimated clan of Verni during the disastrous campaign on Isfahan V, Vermana Cybus, could go on to serve amongst the valiant loyalist crew of the Sisyphum. He stood apart, even in a brotherhood of remarkable warriors, for he had personally witnessed the death of Ferrus Manus at the hands of the treacherous Fulgrim. And those were 40 facts about the Shattered Legions. Thank you guys so much for suggesting that topic. It was really fun lore. Of course, we're not done with this lore. We might come back to it because there's more survivors and there's more notable campaigns that I want to get into. But I'm going to ask a huge favor from you guys. Please suggest down below and let me know what legion you guys would like to get a video from. This is going to be a video for a part 1. So we've already done Imperial Fists, we've already done Salamanders, and we've already done Black Templars for their first initial videos. So what other legion would you guys like to hear about next? It doesn't necessarily have to be a first founding legion, it could be second founding. Just comment down below, put suggestion followed by the legion that you guys would like to hear about, and you'll get a video next week. Thank you guys so much for liking, commenting, and sharing. Don't forget to visit our Patreon. A simple $1 really helps us to continue to grow the channel. You guys are awesome, and I'll catch you tomorrow. This was Gershwan with One Mind Syndicate, signing out.